Beyond accommodations, equipping theater history faculty with neurodiversity affirming curriculum tools. Presented to you by Kathalina Plummer Thorpe. Curriculum Leadership Course, Dr. Senker, Spring 2026. Hello everyone. My name is Kathalina Plummer Thorpe. I'm a PhD student in Curriculum and Instruction at Kent State University, with a background in theater design and education. My work focuses on how curriculum design can better support neurodiverse learners, particularly within the arts. This topic is both academic and personal for me. As an educator, a designer, a student, and a parent. So today, I am really excited to share some practical tools that can support access while preserving the rigor in your theater history classes. Before we get into strategies, I want to take a moment to ground this in a classroom experience. Imagine a student sitting in your theater history class. They're trying to track unfamiliar vocabulary, navigate the dense readings, listen to the lecture, and participate in rapid discussion all at once. They are capable, but the structure is working against them. And see, that's the important distinction. Higher education classrooms already include neurodiverse learners, and the way we design our courses directly shapes how accessible that learning is. You see, theater history courses are often relying on those dense readings, lecture-heavy deliveries, fast-paced conversation, and formal academic writing. And none of these are inherently problematic. They are valuable, rigorous academic practices. But when they are the only ways students are able to engage, they can unintentionally create barriers for some learners. The goal here is not to lower your academic rigor for your course. It's to rethink how students can access that rigor, because small, intentional design choices can significantly improve engagement, clarity, and overall student success. When we look at these two visuals, we're really seeing a snapshot of how student demographics in the United States have evolved over time. The graph here tracks autism prevalence over time, and it goes up to 2022, while the second graphic reflects a more recent estimate across neurodiversity a little more broadly. But what's important is the trend they show together. Over the last 20 years, the demographics of our classroom have changed significantly. When I graduated high school, we'll say about 20 years ago, autism was identified in roughly 1 in 200 students. When my son was diagnosed in 2011, that number was 1 in 150 boys. Today, in 2026, it's closer to 1 in 36 children. Not just boys, not just girls, children. ADHD rates have also increased, now affecting over 11% of children. And we're still seeing a growing number of adults identifying with neurodiversity. In fact, current estimates suggest that nearly 1 in 5 adults identify as neurodivergent, and that number is still on the rise. I myself have ADHD. About 30% of adults under the age of 30 identify as neurodiverse, which includes many of the college students that we teach in our classrooms today. So alongside this increase, we're seeing a broader understanding of what neurodiversity includes. It's not just autism and ADHD. It's a range of cognitive differences that shape how students process, engage, and demonstrate learning. Neurodiversity. Difference in the brain's way of thinking. It's seeing these shifts in who is being identified now more women, more students of color, and more individuals who were historically overlooked by earlier diagnostic models. So, when we think about our classrooms, this is not just a small, isolated group of learners. This is a significant and growing portion of our students, which means the question isn't whether neurodiverse students are present, it's how our course design is either supporting them or unintentionally limiting their access. And that raises the important question to us as their educators. Who are we designing our curriculum for in the next 20 years? Before we move forward, I want to briefly outline what this session is designed to do. By the end of this session, you'll be able to identify at least 3 common barriers that may limit access and engagement for neurodiverse students in theater history courses. You will be able to examine at least 2 neurodiversity affirming tools or strategies that can be integrated into your existing course design. And finally, you'll have the opportunity to revise one lesson, assignment, or classroom routine by applying at least one of these tools in a way that improves access without reducing rigor. The goal here is not to redesign an entire course, but to walk away with something practical that you can implement right away. Now that we've looked at the broader context, I want to focus more specifically on what this can look like in a theater history course. These are some more common curricular structures we see. Dense reading loads with specialized vocabulary, lecture-heavy delivery with limited processing time, rapid discussion with unclear expectations for participation, large, high-stakes writing assignments, and often limited options for how students demonstrate their understanding. We also sometimes see hidden expectations around organization, pacing, or what academic discourse is supposed to look like. Again, none of these are inherently problematic. These are all familiar and valuable components of rigorous academic work. But when multiple demands like these are happening at the same time, they can create a significant cognitive overload for students. And this is where I want to highlight an important idea. The barrier is not the content itself, but it's how students are asked to access and demonstrate that learning that creates the barrier. So the goal moving forward is not to remove those elements, but to think about how you can structure them in ways that support more students in successfully engaging with these materials. Up to this point, we've been looking at where barriers can appear. This slide represents a shift in how we think about responding to those barriers. Accommodation often happens after a barrier appears. Once a student has already encountered difficulty, presented us with an SAS, or shown that they are unable to meet the demands of the course. So we respond by making an adjustment. Neurodiversity affirming design, on the other hand, plans for learner variability from the very beginning. It assumes that students will engage, process, and demonstrate learning in different ways, and it builds that flexibility into the structure of the course. In practice, this doesn't mean changing your content. It means creating clearer pathways to understanding, offering structured supports, and providing more than one way for students to engage with and show their learning. And importantly, this approach is not only beneficial for your neurodiverse students in the class. These kinds of design choices tend to improve clarity, engagement, and success for all learners in the classroom. So the goal here is not to single out a group of students, but to expand access overall, while still preserving the disciplinary rigor and faculty autonomy that these theater courses allow. Here is where I guide you from what barriers look like to what tools and revision become. Throughout the next few examples, we're going to use a simple framework. Identify a barrier, select a tool, and make a targeted revision. This structure will allow you to maintain the core of learning goals of an assignment while improving how students access and engage with the material. Again, the focus here is not to redesign your entire course, but on making small, intentional changes that have meaningful impact throughout. Let's look at our first example using this framework. The barrier here is that students are often encountering dense historical readings that include unfamiliar terminology, abstract concepts, and a significant amount of contextual information. For many students, this creates an overwhelming and high cognitive load before they've even had a chance to fully engage the material. One tool we can use to support this is guided reading, paired with multimodal vocabulary access. So instead of changing the reading itself, we're changing how students approach it. In practice, this might look like providing 4 or 5 focus questions that might help students identify what matters most in the text. You might offer a vocabulary preview with concise definitions, possibly supported with video or audio formats. You might include a note guide or graphic organizer that helps students structure how they process the material. You might also provide optional audio or read aloud access, or include transcripts and captioned materials when the content is introduced in multiple formats. You see, the goal here is not to simplify the content, but to give the students clearer points of entry into layered and complex material. So what does this approach actually accomplish? First, it reduces cognitive overload before the students even begin the reading. Instead of trying to process everything all at once, students have a clearer sense of where to focus their attention. It also helps students identify what matters most within the text, which is something many students struggle with. Often, students approach dense readings feeling like that everything is equally important, which can become quickly overwhelming. By providing structure through guided questions or vocabulary support, we're actually helping them build those skills over time. This also supports vocabulary acquisition within context, rather than asking students to decode unfamiliar language on their own. And importantly, it gives students more than one way to engage with the material, which improves both comprehension and recall. We see often in our classrooms that when students feel overwhelmed or unsure if they're focusing on the right things, they begin to disengage and shut down. But when expectations are clearer and pathways into the material are more structured, students become more confident and better prepared to participate in discussions or activities. Ultimately, these kinds of supports don't reduce rigor. They simply help students build the skills needed to engage with complex material more independently over time. And this is something I've seen consistently across multiple theater courses as both a student and an educator. So as you can see in this example, instead of asking students to just read and take notes, I give them a structure that guides what they pay attention to. And this is completely adaptable to every section of notes, should I wish it. You can see here I've highlighted character types and traits as their focus, so I'm controlling what they focus on and reducing some cognitive load. Then I provide a key vocabulary up front, so they're not searching for what matters, they already know what matters in this section. The character table helps them organize information, and the observation section pushes them to make connections. And then the comic is where they translate that understanding visually. So they're engaging with the material in multiple ways. They're not just writing, they're not just reading. And what this does is it supports different learners without lowering the rigor. It just makes the pathway very clear and very predictable. And so this also sets up great study guides and other adaptable student-regulated learning opportunities. If we don't show them the path into how to set up their notes and how to set up their learning for this rigorous work, they become flustered and overwhelmed. By doing this, we guide them so that this becomes rote memorization and practice ingrained almost as reflexory, because they're doing the thing with a guide. And then, should they be in a situation where they don't have a guide, they can look back and go, you know, this really worked for me. I was able to study. I was able to remember the pictures I drew. I remember that doodle I did. And so this offers multiple modes of entry points to reading and task analysis. Let's look at our second example. This time, we're focused on lecture-based learning. The barrier here is that students are often expected to process long lectures in real time while listening, identifying key ideas, organizing notes, and making connections simultaneously. For many students, that is a significant cognitive load happening all at once. One way that we can support this is through advanced organizers, guided notes, and multimodal lecture supports. So instead of expecting students to build structure as they listen, we can provide that structure in advance. In practice, this might look like sharing a lecture outline ahead of time with key themes, vocabulary, and space for structured notes. During the lecture, spoken content is paired with visual anchors, such as timelines, images, or short clips to reinforce key ideas. And in some cases, this also might include brief moments of active or embodied engagement. For example, students might be prompted to briefly act out or represent a concept, such as something from the Commedia dell'arte characters, or respond to a visual cue embedded in the lecture. These moments don't replace the lecture. They support students in processing and retaining what they're hearing in real time. Again, the goal here is not to simplify your course content, but to make the structure of the lecture more accessible and navigable. These supports help shift a lecture from passive listening experience to a more structured and interactive learning experience. And it goes beyond simply printing out PowerPoint slide handouts to creating adaptive and engaging note-taking systems from both reading and listening. So what does this approach accomplish in a lecture setting? You see, first it reduces the burden of processing and organizing information in real time. Instead of trying to listen, decide what's important, and structure their notes all at once, students are given a clearer pathway to follow. It also helps students anticipate the structure of a lecture and identify major areas as they move through the material. This supports attention, note-taking, and overall retention because students are no longer trying to do everything all at once. By incorporating visual and auditory supports, we're also giving students multiple pathways into the same content. And importantly, this begins to shift lecture from a passive listening experience into something more interactive and navigable. Even small moments, like incorporating a short clip, a visual reference, or a brief interactive prompt, can help anchor understanding and make material more memorable. For example, using something like a short, engaging performance clip can give students a concrete reference point that supports both comprehension and recall.
add humor, and of course they're giggling about it later after class and talking about it. You see, the goal is not to change your content, but to support how students engage with it in real time. So here's an example of what one of my slides might look like for a lecture on Shakespeare. I might say something like, before showing you this clip, I want to briefly ground us in why Shakespeare is still so central in theater history. He is not just an early playwright that we study out of tradition. His work continues to shape how we understand storytelling, character, and performance. He has contributed over 1,700 words and phrases to the English language, many of which we still use today, and so forth. So then, when I introduce something like this clip, using familiar text like Romeo and Juliet, it's not that I'm replacing academic context, it's providing a more accessible entry point into the material that feels linguistically dense and historically distant for students. I've had more than one ask me why we're studying this old dead white guy again. What this does is create a secondary pathway into the same content. Students are still engaging with core concepts like interpretation, performance, and textual analysis, but now they have a concrete, memorable, and even humorous anchor for those ideas. Instead of relying on the lecture alone, we're layering information in a way that supports comprehension and recall. Students are given both clear framework and what to expect, an example that grounds their understanding before they can move into deeper analysis. And more importantly, this doesn't reduce the rigor of what we're teaching them. It just supports the students' access to the complex material more effectively and entertainingly.
For our third example, we are looking at participation. The barrier here is that participation is often measured through spontaneous whole classroom discussion, and this tends to privilege students who are comfortable with quick verbal processing and public speaking, while limiting opportunities for others to engage. We have all seen in our classrooms where we have 3 or 4 students who are willing to talk at any point and guide the entire class, which is not a lot when we're talking classrooms of 20 to 40 students. The tool here is to create more flexible discussion pathways and structured participation formats. So instead of relying on one format, we expand how students prepare for and contribute to discussion. In practice, this might look like giving students a short written response before the discussion, using think, pair, share, or starting with small group analysis before moving into a full class conversation. You might also incorporate collaborative annotation, digital discussion boards, or live polling to gather ideas in different ways. In some cases, this could include more interactive or game-based approaches, such as scenario sorting, review games, or other structured activities that bring elements of play. These approaches give students time to process, build confidence, and engage with the material before being asked to share publicly. Again, the goal is not to remove discussion, but to create a more accessible pathway into it. So what does this approach accomplish in terms of participation? First, it reduces the pressure and anxiety associated with being put on the spot. Instead of requiring immediate verbal responses, students are given time to process their thinking before they share. This supports students who need that additional time, and it allows more learners to engage meaningfully in the conversation. It also broadens participation beyond the most verbally dominant students, creating space for a wider range of voices and perspectives. As a result, the quality of the discussion often improves because students are coming in with more developed ideas. Importantly, this approach preserves discussion as a rigorous learning tool, but makes access to that discussion more equitable. What we often see is that students feel more prepared and confident, and they actually are more willing to participate, not less.
So for example, instead of starting with a discussion, I could give students something concrete to work with first. In the instance that we are discussing absurdism in theater, we would be giving our students short scenarios, and in small groups they would decide, is this statement absurd or not? Why? And if it's not, how do we make it absurd? This gives them time to process, test ideas, and build understanding before they're ever asked to speak in front of the whole class. And you could give them any length of time that you desire, any number of scenarios. Once they've worked through their scenarios conceptually, I add a physical or kinesthetic layer. Students are then given props and asked to stage an absurd moment based on their scenario. They're not just identifying it anymore, they're creating it. This gives them another way to process the concept, especially for students who think better through movement or visuals. So then comes the time where my students would put all of this together. Once they have created these images, they would be told, share them to a shared board, Miro for example, and then each group would contribute multiple examples with their prompts and what makes them absurd. And those become the entry point for the discussion in the very next class. So instead of asking my students to generate an idea on the spot, they would have come in already having processed, tested, and created something the class before. This keeps the rigor of the discussion, but it removes that pressure of immediate participation from the anxiety portion of, oh gosh, please don't call on me, I don't know if I know what I'm talking about. You see, one of the biggest shifts in this model of engagement is that it removes not just the pressure from participation, but also from that anxiety of being correct or knowing if you understand what the material was covering, and that social anxiety. It also introduces play. Even in adult learning environments, play is critical. It is such an opportunity to build connection to material. Would you rather read a chapter of history or play a board game about it? Absurdism stops being this abstract philosophical concept and becomes something students can physically explore. It starts to look like improv or something playful, accessible, low stakes, where anyone can participate, and it's kind of fun. And it takes the history lesson just one step further. All of the content that you've built stays the same. You take a few extra minutes to create a couple of note cards. You still give your lecture as you wrote it, but the engagement piece, that changes. How the students then regurgitate that information, explain what they remember from that lecture. It has something physical to tie to. We're trying to build recall points for students to remember what they learned throughout our classes. This is a beautiful opportunity. Play leads to those anchors.
So now we can move into what this can actually look like in the practice. These are examples of the neurodiversity affirming tools that can be integrated into existing courses without requiring a full redesign. And you'll notice that many of these are relatively small shifts. Things like adding advanced organizers to lectures, providing guided reading questions, or offering structured note-taking supports, using visual elements like timelines, images, or performance clips to reinforce key ideas, making assignment expectations more transparent through clear directions and rubrics, or breaking large assignments into smaller staged checkpoints. You might also think about how discussion is structured or how students are invited to demonstrate their understanding from our previous examples. The key idea here is that these tools don't change what you're teaching. They support how students engage and succeed in that learning. And importantly, these are meant to be flexible. You don't need to use all of them. Just one or two intentional changes can make a meaningful difference in your classroom. Now that we've looked at these examples in this framework in practice, this is the point in a live session where I would move participants into breakout groups, either in Zoom or within the classroom, to apply this thinking for themselves. Each group would receive a sample theater history assignment and work through the process of identifying the core learning goals, recognizing potential barriers, and selecting one intentional revision using a neurodiversity affirming tool. The goal is not to redesign the entire assignment, but to practice making targeted changes that improve access while preserving rigor. In this format, instead, I invite you to take a moment to reflect on the same questions, either using one of the provided examples or one of your own assignments. As we begin to wrap up, I want to highlight a few key takeaways from this session. First, faculty expertise remains central to the course design. This work is not about replacing your knowledge or your approach. It's about supporting it in ways that reach more students. Neurodiversity affirming curriculum is also not about removing rigor. It's about expanding how students access and engage with that rigor. What we've seen is that small tools, small intentional changes can reduce barriers and significantly increase access. And importantly, the goal is not to redesign everything all at once, but to make sustainable, manageable revisions over time. Ultimately, when we support learner variability, we strengthen the learning experience for all students, not just a select few. As we close, I want to bring this back to something simple and actionable. Think about one lesson, one assignment, or one course routine that you currently use. What is one small change you could make? One intentional revision that could improve access for your students? This work does not require a complete redesign. It begins with noticing and choosing to adjust one point at a time. Because access is not something we should add on later. It is something we should design from the very beginning. And when we do that, we are not only supporting the students who need it, we're creating learning environments where more students can engage, succeed, and feel confident and compassionate in their work. And that's where this becomes not just effective teaching, but meaningful, purposeful teaching. I want to thank you so much for your time and engagement in this session. I also want to emphasize that this conversation doesn't have to end here. That's why I attach my email. If you have questions, or if you're trying out one of these ideas, or if you'd like another set of eyes on a lesson or assignment you're working on, I would absolutely welcome you to reach out. I'm always happy to continue the conversation and think through these ideas collaboratively. Thank you again, and have a great day.